Two quick observations before I begin. I'm going to talk about progressive music. So, by definition, the excerpts you'll hear are not representative of what each band plays. They're placed to fill a narrative void, so to speak. To get a complete picture of what's going on for each band, you need to listen to entire albums. I compiled a Spotify playlist with songs from each band I mentioned in this video. You can find the link in the description. Also, the concept of progressive is, again, by definition, quite loose. Many things can be called progressive based on various criteria that anyone can apply. I tried my best to cover every nook and cranny of the style, but still, some bands that someone might expect to find here were left out. This is perhaps the video with the most band references of anything I've ever done. Some things were left out either to avoid overwhelming you by mentioning 750 names, or because I felt they fit better into other categories. Let's go see then. As you know, I always start my videos with the definition of the music style I want to cover. So here we have the definition of progressive metal. If we want to put it simply, it's the combination of progressive rock with heavy metal. Of course, things are clearly not that simple. We need to analyze it a little more. First of all, let's see what progressive rock, or prog as it is often called, is. We can define it as a combination of technical skill on the part of the musicians with complexity in musical themes, styles, harmonies, meter, or rhythm. And all of this is combined with sophisticated and insightful theme in the lyrics, history, literature, sciences, etc., long song durations, and sometimes strong, other times relaxed concept ideas. If we take metal and apply the principles of prog to it, we get progressive metal. So, on the one hand, we have technical skill, complex compositions, innovative orchestrations, eclecticism, and variety, and on the other hand, heavy, distorted guitars. I'm going to add another criterion to all of this: progressiveness in the literal sense of the term, meaning something that pushes music forward, that takes risks, that has ideas. So you'll see that even some bands you might not expect will enter into the progressive metal discussion. But it's better to wait and see everything up close. As with many things in progressive rock, even in its metal side, the ones who started it all were Robert Fripp's King Crimson. Their song 21st Century Schizoid Man, recorded in the summer of 1969, has been cited by many as the first progressive metal song, sometimes the first heavy metal song. Few bands at that time had songs as harsh and aggressive as that one. Of course, King Crimson also add other elements that make the song uniquely progressive, the most important being the bold use of dissonance. They would build a very successful career based on trying new things. And regarding our story, we will meet them again at moments of their album Lark's Tongues in Aspic, 1973, and practically throughout Red, 1974, an album made by just 3 people, with the group practically disbanded, carrying an almost monolithic heaviness, thus giving birth to the genre we are examining in a fully realized form. The second cornerstone of progressive metal is none other than the Canadian band Rush. They started as a hard rock group, influenced by Led Zeppelin. Soon, they started experimenting, initially without success. They made their big breakthrough in 1976 when they went full-on prog on their album 2112, with a track that took up an entire LP side, themes influenced by science fiction, and so on. This, of course, didn't mean they forgot their heavy side, which ensured they set the mold for the future of progressive metal sound. Their next 2 albums, A Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, simply confirmed what had already begun. Before I move on, it's worth mentioning another prog legend, Genesis, who experimented with many things, including heaviness, in tracks like The Knife from 1970 and The Musical Box from 1971. Also present in our discourse is the great Jethro Tull, who, in albums like Aqualung, Benefit, or Minstrel in the Gallery, gave us tracks with heavily distorted electric guitar that became legendary for many metal fans as well. So they can also be considered an influence. If we're looking for something closer to the Rush side, we could mention the most important American prog band of the era, namely Kansas, who, with songs like Carry On Wayward Son or the lesser known Lightning's Hand, certainly contributed their part to building the scene. Now, I could stop here, but that would leave the story half told. Because at that time, progressive rock was so popular that many well known hard rock bands often borrowed ideas and experimented with things influenced by it. Long song durations, changes within songs, intellectual themes in the lyrics, etc. For example, I can mention Uriah Heep, especially on albums like Salisbury or Look at Yourself, the always underrated Wishbone Ash in their first three albums, Ritchie Blackmore and Ronnie James Dio's Rainbow, particularly on Rainbow Rising, Queen, especially on their second album, Queen 2, but also A Night at the Opera, where the somewhat neglected 8-minute track, The Prophet's Song, can be found, as well as Black Sabbath on both Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage. Finally, I'd like to say that there are a number of bands from the early 70s belonging to heavy psychedelia or proto metal, however you want to call it, who also seemed particularly influenced by the newly emerging and very hot at the time prog scene. I'm talking about bands like Atomic Rooster, Nectar, Birth Control, Clear Blue Sky, Night Sun, UFO, pre-Michael Schenker, and many others. As early as the mid-70s, and as we approached the end of the decade, the popularity of prog began to decline. The sudden appearance of punk on the horizon, as well as the gradual rise of bands like Judas Priest, had one main consequence. The new mantra for the proponents of the modern rock sound was to be simpler, more direct, and more straightforward. Thus, the progressive heavy experiments almost completely disappeared. Rush were practically the last ones left, and even they, from their 1980 album Permanent Waves onwards, gradually began to change their sound. And yet, after the huge void that followed the early years of heavy metal's rise, the still unformed genre would receive unexpected help from the kings of the new wave of British heavy metal at a time when that movement seemed to have already run its course. On their 1982 album, The Number of the Beast, Iron Maiden had a 7-minute song, Hallowed Be Thy Name. On their 1983 album, Peace of Mind, 2 7-minute songs, Revelations and To Tame a Land. And on 1984's Power Slave, an almost 14-minute one, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. All of this came from bassist Steve Harris's love for 70s prog and complex labyrinthine tracks, as well as from the excellent level of familiarity that the band's new singer at the time, Bruce Dickinson, had in themes of history and literature. Iron Maiden will be one of the proven influences on progressive metal's Big Three, which we will examine right away. Queensryche was founded in Seattle in 1982. That same year, a self-titled EP based on their first demo was released in a limited number of copies. In 1983, they will re-release it properly this time, while in 1984, they will give us a first album, The Warning, clearly influenced by Iron Maiden. Until then, they were firmly placed in the US power metal category, which would begin to change with the highly innovative and experimental Rage for Order from 1986 and, most importantly, with Operation Mindcrime from 1988. The former is often recognized as one of the first progressive metal albums ever released, primarily due to its ideas and originality, while the latter is an incredibly catchy, intelligent, and dynamic concept album that, despite its difficult subject matter, flows effortlessly and would mark the band's trajectory, remaining unsurpassed to this day. The continuation of their journey will hold surprises, some positive, others negative, which we will see in subsequent chapters. Fates Warning were also founded in 1982 in Hartford, Connecticut. Their first two albums, Nights on Brocken, 1984, and The Spectre Within, 1985, were again categorized as U.S. power metal, although they contained both Iron Maiden influences and clear signs of prog. The album that will send them straight to the top of the new genre will be 1986's Awaken the Guardian, which is also considered one of the first progressive metal albums ever released. Here, the approach is somewhat more traditionally prog compared to Rage for Order, relying more on the performer's technical skill and the complexity of the songs, rather than experimentation. This will be followed by their biggest selling album, 1988's No Exit, as well as 1989's Perfect Symmetry and 1991's Parallels, which will be even more groundbreaking and will solidify their status as leaders of this new genre. Dream Theater were founded as Majesty in 1985 in Boston, when three New Yorkers studying music there, John Petrucci, John Myung, Mike Portnoy, decided to form a band. After the addition of keyboardist Kevin Moore, a childhood friend of Petrucci, and singer Charlie Dominici, the band will change its name and release their first album in 1989. It won't go unnoticed, but it won't do anything significant either. After hiring new singer James Labrie, they will release Images and Words in 1992 and achieve their big breakthrough. They may not have started the genre like the other two, but they were the ones who brought it to the mainstream, the ones who put it on the map, so to speak. After this album, the term progressive metal began to be used systematically by everyone. Their path into the future will remain firmly attached to this genre, even today. Queensryche had also achieved tremendous success with Empire in 1990, but what they were playing there, for various reasons, was categorized closer to glam metal or even art rock. Now, at the opening image of the chapter, you can see a +1. What does that mean? The fact that there was also a band from Austin, Texas, called Watchtower, who beat everyone else to the punch when they released Energetic Disassembly in early 1985. They were playing a form of thrash that seemed to have come from the future. Here, both technicality and originality were on an industrial scale. No one was even remotely playing anything similar back then. There was only one problem. The release was done by the band themselves, and only 3,000 records and 1,500 cassettes were printed. The audience that heard it, even with the cassette-to-cassette copying that existed back then, was much smaller, and so the band never achieved the status of the other three. Eager taste for victory, I'm sure I'm impressed. Well, if we consider that the style officially began in 1986, the appearance of bands that followed it wouldn't be long in coming at all. Here I will once again ask for Rate Your Music's help. From 1979 to 1986, we had 10 progressive metal albums. From 1987 to 1994, 321 progressive metal albums. Now, how am I going to cover all of them? I'll start with the bands that stood out, either when they came out or in the future. First, the Americans from San Diego, Psychotic Waltz. Their debut, A Social Grace from 1990, as well as its 1992 successor, Into the Everflow, are simply almost on par with the big three in every way. Their compatriots, Shadow Gallery from Pennsylvania, founded in 1991, released their excellent self-titled debut in 1992. They will continue to faithfully serve the style in the following years. German band Siege is Even started as technical thrash with their 1988 album, Life Cycle, only to transition into the realm of progressive metal with Steps, 1990, and A Sense of Change, 1991. And since I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, I can't help but talk about some of the more unusual artists. Californians Mr. Bungle, fronted by Mike Patton, who turned schizophrenia into music on their 1991 self-titled debut. The more alternative Texans Galactic Cowboys, especially on their 1993 album Space in Your Face, and even Jane's Addiction, who had 3 tracks over 7 minutes long on the second side of their smash Ritual de lo Habitual. Let's go and look at another phenomenon now. Like water finding a void and starting to flow every place within a forest, the characteristics of progressive metal began to permeate every form of heavy sound we could think of. Firstly, thrash metal, starting with the Canadian band Voivod, a unique case of a band that defied boundaries and literally did whatever they wanted, and who would transcend thrash by giving us the 1989 progressive metal masterpiece, Nothing Face. The German band Mekong Delta, who followed in the footsteps of Watchtower and whose releases, starting with 1988's The Music of Eric Zahn, would chart a course that would lead them to pure progressive metal, and the Swiss Giants Coroner, whose every release would take them a step further, culminating in the unique Grin of 1993. Here, I could also mention the well-known and highly successful And Justice for All and Rust in Peace, as well as the second album by Watchtower, Control and Resistance, which perfected the ideas of energetic disassembly, and all of them were not unique cases. I will also remind you of other bands that, starting with thrash, served the progressive sound during those years. Secondly, death metal, beginning with Atheist from Sarasota, for whom the term technical death metal was coined, and who revolutionized the genre in just 2 albums, continuing with the genre's fathers, Death, who, after 1991's Human, began to become increasingly progressive, and ending with fellow Floridian Cynic, who in 1993 pushed the genre to its limits with Focus, which for many was more progressive metal than tech death. We still had Thirdly, heavy/power metal, which was the genre from which progressive metal originated in the first place. So we can say that the steps of Fates Warning and Queensryche were followed by And finally, the so-called neoclassical metal, meaning the various amazing guitarists who were releasing instrumental albums which at the time sold extremely well and were hailed as the new saviors of the sixth string. Their expansion towards progressive metal was simply the next logical step, I remind you. When things started to change in 1992 and excessive technicality and complexity went out of fashion, progressive metal was not only unaffected but taking advantage of the vacuum created by the decline of the more traditional genres that had dominated until then, came to the forefront of the resistance, so to speak, against the new musical order and grew enormously in the next period we will examine. Where do you even begin and where do you end? Really? A genre in constant turmoil, with new names popping up, as I often say, like mushrooms. We will try to bring order to the chaos by starting with what happened to the Big Three. Queensryche achieved global recognition with Empire, which was perhaps a bit simpler than it should have been, and they came back to reality with Promised Land, which was perhaps a bit more complex than it should have been. From then on, they decided to become modern, abandoned progressive rock, and were abandoned by most of their fans. Fate's Warning gradually became more experimental, but they never stopped serving the progressive sound, accepting that they would never become a very big name. After a somewhat awkward attempt to enter the big leagues, Dream Theater decided to focus on what they did well and became leading figures of the style, releasing some of the best and most well-known albums in its history. Regarding the new names, we saw the gradual emergence of what I would call the second great trio of progressive metal. Initially, the Californian band Tool, although perhaps the most distant from the traditional metal sound, were appreciated by a large part of the heavy rock world, both for their original ideas and their exceptional technical skills. Ultimately, they are the ones who perhaps more than anyone embodied the true spirit of past giants, like King Crimson. They opened the era with the awesome 1996 album Enema and closed it with the incredible 2001 album Lateralis. They created a huge critical mass of fanatical followers at a level we only see with cult bands, even though they were always hugely successful, even at times when that made absolutely no sense. Secondly, the Swedish band Opeth, who dared to combine death metal vocals and the genre's aggression with passages straight from the 70s, gained a steadily increasing appeal, leading to the triumphant success of the albums they released in the 2000s, particularly in America. The man who would gradually become their undisputed leader, Mikael Åkerfeldt, was a guy with a vast musical education steeped in 70s progressive rock in all its forms, something he constantly demonstrated in what he played in Opeth. And finally, the also Swedish band Meshuggah, who invented a completely different way to play thrash death metal, focusing on things like polyrhythms, dissonance, odd time signatures, and extremely technical playing. When their style hit the mainstream with their 2008 album Obscene, it had such an impact that a new subgenre of metal was created, practically based solely on their sound. I don't know what you want to call them. Thrash, death, call them whatever you like. I just categorize them as extreme progressive metal. Of course, we're not finished here. In the most traditional progressive metal scene, we saw the rise of the American bands Symphony X and Nevermore, who, following the trends of the time, achieved significantly greater success in Europe than in their homeland, the Swedish band Pain of Salvation, who delivered progressive metal of the highest intellectual level. The Norwegian band Green Carnation with their 60-minute track, Light of Day, Day of Darkness. The also Swedish band Evergrey with an exceptionally consistent career that continuously provides us with high-quality music. And the Dutch band Aryan by Arjen Anthony Lucassen, who was designing and implementing grandiose rock operas at a time when such a thing was completely contrary to what was prevalent in heavy music. I should also mention two names that were direct offshoots from two of the greats of the genre. Liquid Tension Experiment, a side project of half of Dream Theater, along with a member of King Crimson, and Spastic Inc., the Jarzembek brothers band, which in many ways was the logical continuation of Watchtower. Also, U.S. power metal legends, Savatage from Tarpon Springs, Florida, after dealing with the terrible tragedy of losing guitarist and founding member Chris Oliva, started becoming increasingly progressive in the 4 studio albums they released from 1994 to 2001. It will be interesting to see whether this trend will continue in their final album of 2026. Now, there was also a series of bands that came from other genres, but gradually started approaching progressive metal until they eventually became part of it. By the time of The Sound of Perseverance, Death was a recognized member of the genre. And it's a shame that due to circumstances outside of music, this album didn't have a follow-up. From the melodic death metal scene, we saw the Swedish band Edge of Sanity come and give us the excellent Crimson in 1996, and the Finnish band Amorphous with Elegy and Tuonela, which were preparing us for the heights they would reach in the 2000s. From the black metal scene, we had Enslaved transforming from Viking metal pioneers into one of the most important progressive metal bands in history, and In the Woods, who, after contributing to the definition of atmospheric black metal, gave us the progressive gem Omnio in 1997. I will close the book on classic progressive metal with one of the genre's greatest figures over the years, Canadian guitarist Devin Townsend, who, after exhausting his extreme metal cravings with Strapping Young Lad, began producing progressive metal gems with 4 albums during the period we are examining: Biomech, Infinity, Physicist, and Teria. Within this 5-year period, many other names emerged that are worth mentioning. Here are some examples.
Evangelize the land and make it pure again. Look behind you, you've seen the kingdoms fall. When it was too much to I awake the trees and give them speech. Their words will cheat.
Now, continuing what I started in the previous chapter, I will also mention a series of strange guys who approached progressive music from a different perspective, but I believe they are worth mentioning. You might already know some of them. Many were given the rather vague term avant-garde metal, which cannot describe what they play, so I urge you to listen to entire albums of theirs.
Never mind, take this land, we are also beyond.
Before I close this chapter, I'll also talk about a genre that is by definition progressive, but I don't know whether it could be called metal. I'm talking about mathcore, an evolution of the core sound that includes complex rhythms, unusual time signatures, syncopated and dissonant riffs, and irregular meter changes. So, practically, things we also find in progressive metal. Its most well known representatives in the metal community are, of course, the Dillinger Escape Plan from Morris Plains, New Jersey, while some other names of interest are Botch from Washington State, Converge from Massachusetts, Gaza from Utah, Burnt by the Sun also from New Jersey, and finally, Every Time I Die from Buffalo.
I tried to fall.
One of the main reasons this 8-year period has a special chapter is the emergence of two new groups that, although initially coming from different backgrounds, would achieve great success and recognition when they fully entered the progressive metal scene. Gojira were founded in a small town of southwestern France in 1996. With a stable lineup since 1998, they started under the name Godzilla, before opting for the Japanese version of that in 2001. After 4 demo albums within the broader death metal genre, they will release their first proper album, Terra Incognita, in 2001. With each new release, they moved further away from death metal, getting closer and closer to progressive metal, using the very distinctive, unique, syncopated riffs, which would become their trademark. Each new release brought them even more recognition and success, to the point where they became one of the biggest names of the new heavy metal, a status they comfortably maintain to this day. Mastodon were formed in Atlanta, Georgia in 2000. Their debut, Remission, will be released in 2002 and will feature mostly sludge metal, with just hints of what was to come. However, on their next album, 2004's Leviathan, two things will happen. Their sound and themes will clearly lean towards progressive, and they will begin to make their presence felt in the heavy metal universe. Their trajectory back then was very similar to that of Gojira. Each new album surpassed the previous one in success and quality, making them even more famous. For me, their peak is 2009's Crack the Sky, although everything they've done maintains an exceptionally high standard, with progressive metal always being the glue that binds the various styles they might experiment with each time. In 2025, the first change in their lineup will occur with the departure of guitarist Brett Hines, who will unfortunately die in an accident shortly after. Beyond these two, the era brought absolute recognition for both Opeth and Meshuggah, while Tool easily maintained their leading position with the formidable 10,000 Days in 2006. The great Devin Townsend disbanded Strapping Young Lad and began releasing albums in industrial quantities, keeping the concept of progressive metal as a common thread throughout. He gave us 7 new releases in the period we're examining. Let's now look at some new names that emerged and achieved significant recognition during these 8 years. Between the Buried and Me from Raleigh, North Carolina started with strong elements of death metal and metalcore in their sound, which were almost immediately placed under a thick layer of progressiveness that keeps them at the forefront of the sound to this day. Close in origin, although even more schizophrenically technical, are the Canadian band Protest the Hero. The Polish band Riverside made an impression because they often walked the line between progressive rock and progressive metal, although during the period we are examining, they leaned more toward the latter. The German collective The Ocean started as exponents of atmospheric sludge metal, although their entire aesthetic in lyrics, themes, and album covers clearly referenced progressive metal, which would eventually monopolize their sound too. The Swedish band Diablo Swing Orchestra will make a big impression by playing practically what their name describes: progressive metal combined with classical music, swing, jazz, cabaret, opera, and anything else you can imagine. The 2 albums released in 2006 and 2009 remain examples of schizophrenic progressive metal that is not influenced by Mr. Bungle. Finally, the Israeli band Orphaned Land, although starting with many elements from death and folk metal, will release their progressive masterpiece, Mabul, the story of the three sons of seven, within the period we are examining. I'll conclude with perhaps the most unique case in the entire video. A British band that was firmly a progressive rock artist throughout the 90s, with elements of psychedelia, alternative rock, and something that experts call post-Britpop, decided on their 2002 album In Absentia to incorporate metal elements into their sound, a trend they would continue in their next two albums. As a consequence, Porcupine Tree quickly gained attention and recognition from many metalheads, while their leader, Steven Wilson, became a kind of guru for the entire progressive scene, rock and metal, collaborating with artists like Mikhail Ockerfeldt, remixing classic 70s albums, and so on. As for the avant-garde scene, things progressed there as well, although the genre will be given its due in the next chapter. From the various artists of the period, I singled out
Who have my name? Who dare I to
the, let's say, modern era of the genre continued to produce very important artists who, in the years that have passed until the time this video is being made, have managed to show how important they are, remaining dynamic representatives of the genre. Australian band Ne Obliviscaries made a huge impression with their 2012 album, Portal of Eye, and continues to release very high-quality albums to this day, demonstrating that they are a force to be reckoned with in the scene. Imagine Between the Buried and Me with more acoustic parts and without the core dimension. The Norwegian band Leprous had a bit of a push when they started out, as they were the backing band for Isan of Emperor, who contributed in various ways to their early releases. However, they quickly proved they could do it very well on their own, becoming one of the biggest names of the genre. The Australian band Caligula's Horse also emerged in the last 15 years, thanks to their unique combination of soft and heavy sounds, using various structures typical of progressive rock, concept albums, albums divided into sections, and managing to make the complex sound simple. The English band Hawken, hailing from the country with the greatest tradition in progressive music, honored the jersey, so to speak, by playing music that was cleverly structured, poetically narrated, and unexpectedly catchy. Finally, the Boston band Wildren surprises us by delivering progressive metal with elements that are primarily found in European bands, such as epic folk grandeur. The most malicious would say that in the mid-2010s, they sounded more like Opeth than Opeth themselves. However, beyond the genre in its most orthodox form, we had during the period we are examining the gradual emergence of a phenomenon that I could describe as the universal collapse of boundaries between musical genres, or what I call micro-genres. In other words, genres that often combine completely disparate on paper musical idioms played by one specific band. And that's it. I've often been criticized in various videos for over-categorizing, with the simple argument that everything is rock, and that's it. Yes, that's true, except that this categorization was absolutely vital in the good old days, when you'd go to a record store not having heard anything from 80% of the albums they had there. So, how would you decide what to buy? Back then, even which section of the record store the album was placed in mattered. Heavy metal, thrash metal, death metal, hard rock, alternative, gothic, etc. That was certainly restrictive for the musicians, but they couldn't do anything about it. Let's go back to the early 2010s. Quote, illegal unquote downloading is now something anyone can do. New albums are leaking almost before they come out. Shortly after, the streaming services will arrive, and we're done. Result: now you've heard almost every album as soon as it comes out. The reason for the existence of musical genres has disappeared. Thus, gradually, the phenomenon I just described began to develop more and more, which today is not just a reality, but perhaps even a requirement in the field of heavy music. Now you're going to tell me what that has to do with progressive. But obviously it does. First of all, for someone to be able to transition from one musical style to another, and a completely different one for that matter, they need technical skill. Progressiveness is needed in thought and imagination. It's a change in pace and mood that adds a level of complexity to the track. So, if any of the combined genres belong to the metal scene, we're talking about something to which the term progressive metal can be applied. So let's take a look at a series of names that uniquely combine various musical genres, making the result sound clearly progressive, however you interpret the term.
Don't you dare look away!
I will conclude this video with special mentions to some more extreme styles and artists that exhibit strong elements of progressiveness and technicality, and so deserve special mention. The style of djent is one of the latest musical genres to emerge in the metal scene. If you look at the highest rated albums on Rate Your Music in the genre's history, the top 6 are Meshuggah albums, which is logical since the genre is essentially a formalized version of Meshuggah's sound. The most prominent representatives of djent are the Danish band Vola, the Swedish band Vildhjarta, American bands Animals as Leaders and Periphery, British band Tesseract, and Dutch band Textures. In the early part of the previous decade, the style was very in fashion, so to speak, although it has somewhat declined in recent years. Still, it has certainly left its mark in the realm of heavy progressivism. Chilean band Inanna and American band Orgon show us where things are headed in the progressive metal sound. They both, like many others in the past, come from somewhere else, which in their case is death metal. Although they don't overlook their main sound, the combinations they create, the innovative way they execute their ideas, and the originality they introduce to their sound practically place them at the forefront of the new extreme progressive metal, at the top of which are undoubtedly Blood Incantation from Denver, Colorado. A band I've mentioned in other videos, they practically close the circle on the concept of progressiveness by making something incredibly difficult seem very simple. They transition from pure death metal, morbid angel style, to 70s prog and krautrock, all within a single song. And the whole concept works perfectly. It sounds completely natural and is accepted without any problem by everyone who hears it. As things stand, it seems like heavy music still has a lot to offer, 55 years after its beginning.